I'm Neil Denari. I'm an architect, and we're here in my office in West Adams district of Los Angeles. It's a changing neighborhood, represents a lot of the cultural and political possibilities and conflicts of what's going on in Los Angeles right now. It's really interesting to be a part of this landscape. I'm also a sound maker, a sound manipulator. I write and make graphic design as well. I like to do a lot of things, but it's all centered around, my work as an architect. I decided to study architecture when I was quite young, or I decided to be an architect. I didn't exactly know what an architect did, obviously, on a daily level. But I grew up in America and in the end of the baby boomer period, more or less. And the landscape was changing mostly around suburbia. So I grew up in the suburbs in Texas outside of Dallas and Fort Worth. They're the two, not the biggest cities in Texas, but two bigger cities. And I saw this environment essentially grow, and architecture was a part of it. A lot of it was modernist and changing, and I saw urban buildings that were different than suburban houses. And so I was thinking that architecture was only about the new, and architecture was always about the moment, even when I was young. And like a lot of kids, especially male, probably fascinated with technology at some level. I don't want to put a gender on that so much, but then I thought architects design big things, and maybe that taps into the ego of the architect. On the one hand, I just still didn't know much about it, and I just stayed connected to that commitment as I grew up. And I decided to study architecture in Houston because I wanted to study in the biggest city in my state. And I did have the goal and the view to go to the East Coast before I came to the West Coast. And then the goal was to go to the grad school on the East Coast, which I did. So I kind of had a path. I got to get from my upbringing to, the major, quote, major metropolis, study architecture there, have as much context, both of the city and also global context, then go to the East Coast and go to the West Coast. So I kind of had America mapped out in my mind, which is here, here, and here. And it's going to give me the broadest education. So going to New York after graduate school was just a really clear idea. I wasn't ready to come to the West Coast yet because I wanted to experience life and culture, especially in New York, the singular, city, world city. I thought I was only going to be there maybe a year and a half or so, like, oh, that'll be long enough, I'll get a job. I ended up being there almost 6 years because music, I became more immersed in music. I lived around the corner from CBGB's, the old punk club. I would see Philip Glass walking down the street and Lou Reed walking down the street, and it's like, wow, and David Byrne. This is really cool. I mean, just to be a part of that. I wasn't a professional musician, of course, but that helped shape my, worldview. And then coming out here, it was for architecture and for the idea that you could come out and in a way be who you wanted to be. The media was less intrusive and heavy and judgmental. Frank Gehry, while he wasn't my idol or anything like that, I did have Frank in studio at GSD. But younger offices like Morphosis, for instance, were offices I knew who were just kind of coming out here and doing it. And I came for the horizontality. I came for this idea of Los Angeles as the city of the future, which it's not necessarily anymore. I came for the idea that it's the edge of the West. I came for the weather, like so many people. I came for the complexity of the ecology of the landscape. I came for people, and I came for this kind of mystery in a way. One thing, though, to talk about as time goes on with my life here, Los Angeles, at least in terms of an airplane flight, it's the same amount of time to Tokyo as it is to London. So this is actually on the center line between Asia and Europe. Obviously, if you live in New York, it's more Euro biased. So, and I've always felt like I've got some knowledge and affinities for both Europe. Over time, it's been more about my relationship to Asia, in fact. But LA was the center line and is the center line. That's my world. I feel like I live in the center in Los Angeles. That's just my bias. That's my centrism, about the city. In some ways, we all want to be in the center, and at the same time, we all want to be on the edge. Like we want to be insiders and we want to be outsiders, right? We want to be with our tribe, and then yet we want to be, new and original and off. Los Angeles is the center and also the edge and the periphery in my mind, and that's why it's so fascinating to be an architect here and to live here and to enjoy so many amazing things and aspects and people especially. My interest in music, strong interest in music, only started when I was in college, when I had friends, older friends, who could turn me on primarily at that time to punk rock, because it was still, mainstream things that I heard. And then I was turned on to punk rock and, heard the Ramones and then later people like Brian Eno and Talking Heads. And I just fell in love with that form of being able to, of music and that form of culture, to be able to connect with, sort of older generation, like my brother, 7 years older than me, might have been connected to, rock and roll, but this was a new form of music, as you know. And then later, when I lived in New York, hip hop, although I don't make hip hop genre music, I lived in New York, and that whole side of things also, because it's really the last great form of music that's been invented. It happened later, and then that's when I started playing, when I lived in New York in my early 20s. Graphic design is just part of architecture. Writing is part of architecture. Photography and film, in my mind, are also part of architecture in terms of visual culture. I really feel like my particular practice is completely connected to touching all of those. It's a little bit of a unique approach, I think, among my colleagues. I'm a little bit younger than, say, David Byrne or Sex Pistols or something like that, or the Ramones. My generation band is Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth. They're pretty much my age, and they were my band when I lived in New York, and I saw them on the streets, and I saw them at CBGBs all the time. So yeah, I identify with, in some ways, post-punk bands, and there are other ones, like there was a band called Mission of Burma in Boston around my age as well. And music, and talking about music, especially with you, you're a touring musician and so forth, and thinking about that and what it means for architecture. One question you may be always thinking about for yourself, or you get, was what's the relationship between music and architecture? And sometimes I say, well, there's no direct relationship, like the stuff I like to listen to or make looks like what I do. It's really just a general sense of, I would say, what experimentation is. So I've always tended toward, more experimental music. I don't listen to the blues very much. I really have always focused more on sound. And in a way, I could say that that's the most analogous relationship to architecture, which is we're all trying to find languages to work with and manipulate. And musicians are the same way, because you struggle to get out of genre and really, make new things, as you know. I feel like I'm just generally like a baby boomer post-war American. I grew up in Texas, but my parents weren't from Texas, so we had no roots. And so in a way, I was only connected to the idea of contemporary life, in my head. So the local nature of that world wasn't so, there is local culture there, but I didn't find interest in it. And so I found interest in what we would imagine to be global culture, even at a young age. Vietnam War, it's an event that's going on far away, and it's not, a local idea, and those things. Civil rights, I felt like as a kid watching TV and being somebody who was interested in culture as much as I could, as a kid through TV and things like that, that I would just say I'm an American, in that sense. And I lived in New York for 5 years in my 20s, incredibly important time. And I've been in Los Angeles for 33 years. And so you might say, well, Los Angeles has to be the most particular place at this point, and it is. But I did time in Paris after grad school. I lived in Tokyo for a year. And so all of these things build up. I would say I acknowledge my pathway through the world. And I always acknowledge that I'm from Texas, originally. But in a spiritual sense, I would say Los Angeles, for sure, as the place which is got local culture, but it's also a culture that has projected itself out through the media. Therefore, Los Angeles is itself and something else all the time. I feel like I'm a citizen of that kind of culture. I think getting back to America, the biggest factor for, really me, and obviously a lot of Americans, was the car. And so, an automobile-dominated city, for which almost all of America is, versus New York, or versus Tokyo, or versus Paris, where I didn't deal with the car. That's a pretty fundamental difference for a lot of people around the world about what's a city and what's not a city. Somebody could say, is Bangkok a city? Yes, it is. It doesn't have any subways. It's just cars everywhere all the time, completely stratified horizontal city, just like Los Angeles. But I don't think anybody in the world would say Bangkok's not a city, even though a lot of people would say LA is just one giant suburb. Now, I don't want to get into the the politics of urban identity so much, but the defining characteristics between places, it has to do with how you move around. The other thing about Los Angeles that I've always felt, and one of the reasons why I came here, and why also when I was reading in New York, English author J.G. Ballard, who's not a sci-fi writer, but a person who wrote about the ways in which technology affected people's lives. He always wrote about California as being, a place where you could make it up inside your head, because it's not a fully formed idea of a traditional city. So everybody who lives in LA sees what they see out there, but also how we reform the city based on our movements, our pathways, who we know, where we go. That's really the reconfiguring of the city. New York presents itself to you more fully formed, and you're making it in your head is sort of different. So the mystery of Los Angeles, because I call it the great unsolved urban mystery, no one solved what it is or what it could be yet. And that's why I'm here, because it's so mysterious. And in a way that makes your question a little bit challenging, which is, what are the specific things? Some of it is the unknown. I didn't have any teachers or professors in my studies who were mentors or became mentors. Let's say the way some students still treat me as a mentor, years later. That's a funny irony. I've been teaching for all this time and I'm looked at as a mentor. I didn't have one, in school. I had one teacher, he's an artist named Paul Rotterdam, and he taught drawing and painting at Harvard. And he became, if anything, I wouldn't say a mentor because it's not like I call him and talk to him. He became an influential teacher. When I got to New York, the late Lebbeus Woods, who was an experimental architect, and Stephen Hall, who you probably know, they're 10, 15 years older than me. I think they became people that I could obviously track in terms of ideas and careers. Lebbeus, I wouldn't say was a mentor as much as a friend. And so if I think about Stephen Hall or Tom Main, who are, the generation above me, they're both friends and colleagues as well as mentors. And I think I relate to them more as people that I can learn from, but also people that I just directly have a conversation with. So in some ways, I have a different idea about what a mentor is. I learn from everybody, that I engage with. But I think that I engage with, let's say, the architects of a generation above me, not only in a way to learn, but to just have conversations about contemporary life and culture, in which case we cross and we intersect in ways that it's really not about generations. Even though they built a lot more, I have a lot of questions to ask them about certain things. I think mostly we relate to one another as architects. I think I'm lucky. I'm not trying to reject the idea that I haven't had any mentors, because many, many people have been influential for me, but in different ways. Michael Rotundi, who, when I moved here, of course, was still partners with Tom Main and Morphosis, and he was the one who brought me, he allowed me to come to Los Angeles without any worry, because even when I lived in New York, he offered me a job at SciArc, so I could just pull the plug in New York at some point when I wanted to drive out, and I started teaching, so I was lucky with that. And I had a very good relationship with Michael, and still do. And of course, when I became director at SciArc, I took Michael's place, and Michael, was, as far as the school goes, quite a bit, definitely a mentor. Ray Cappy, who founded the school, also, relative to the school, I would say was definitely a mentor and a confidant, especially in LA. And but you're right, it's mostly about the community, and there's not like a guru necessarily. And I think you could ask a lot of really good architects and they would say, no, I don't have a guru. I make my work, I put it in the world, and then I engage in conversations and feedback, and there's sort of forces and influences that happen with that. I enjoy being a teacher for whom students continue to let's say ask my advice on whether it's job related things or career advice, things like that. Those things that might be more conventional to a mentor. So I definitely love playing the role of the mentor at the same time. Going back to to people who've in a way they're older and they've been there and they've gone through certain things. One thing that I tell anybody now is something that Wolf Prix of Co-op Himmelblau told me one time. He said, you have to ask for 200% to get 100%. And I think you know what that means, right? To get what you really think you might want to achieve out of a project, you have to go here. In other words, move the target well beyond, so that your client, I'm strictly talking about in terms of a commission, right, and a client. You have to go way out there and because they're not going to go that far. But if you only ask for 100, you're only going to get 50. So whatever you want, double it. And I said, that's interesting. And I said, how's that really work? And he said, because the client knows you're going to ask for 200%. That's why they only give you half the budget. Then you go for 200%, and then when you get back to 100, the budget is 100%. So it's a funny game about power, I would say. Some people would say it would be about ego, and I think he was saying it, and the way in which I talk to anybody with that is, how do you manage ambition, and how do you manage, expectation? Of course, the ambition is always to do the greatest work, but you're not in control of everything. So there are some techniques, and no one would call those techniques, dishonest. It's mostly about ambition. I just want to keep going, and so I learned that, and generally I always try to ask for 200% and see what I get.
Maybe that happens in every part of the world.
Absolutely, it's universal. He's telling me from his point of view in Austria, there's nothing culturally specific about that. It's a way of working. But that's also one, I would say, talking to architects of a generation above me about practice and about office life and about, these kinds of techniques of how do you navigate things that are much, much more mysterious for me. I do talk to them, about that, but our relationship doesn't focus on that. Our relationship focuses on ideas and exchanging ideas and where the work goes. And, we all just try to do what we can with the professional side of things. But that was one good professional bit of advice that's helped me over the years. It might be even a little bit of a miracle that I made it this far, because I didn't have I never had anything concrete in my mind, except when I was young, I would say, I imagine I'll have my own office one day. I just imagined that, and the reason why I imagined it is because I'm just interested in ideas, and I know that I wouldn't be able to, quote, carry out ideas in any other condition other than owning my own ideas and being able to, navigate them. The process to get there, complete question mark, complete mystery, had no idea. And my particular story is, yes, I went to New York and got a job, didn't have any sense of timing or anything. I'm going to come to LA at some point. After 3 years only out of school, I started teaching. It was quite unexpected. I was asked to do a studio at Columbia. And after I taught my first semester and then they invited me back, I said, okay, well, I can make a little bit of money. And now I see I can have some independence, and I quit my job, the only real professional job I had, and I started teaching, and I, was able to take care of myself and do my theoretical projects. But from the time I stopped working in an office until I got my first built project was 13 years. So I spent 13 years doing exhibitions, making theoretical work, doing competitions, doing drawings, making models, having shows. And that 13-year period, half of which was in New York and half of which was in, actually mostly it was in LA, is super integral to where I am today, because that's of course like, you know, the Beatles going to Hamburg, right, and playing night after night after night before they make their first record. So this is like rehearsing and thinking and being able to come to a client and say, I have ideas. I have ideas. So I didn't wait for anything, but I didn't also try to go find my first job as soon as possible at all costs. I did not do that. I didn't know how to do that, and it wasn't the natural pathway for me. My natural pathway was work, make ideas, and trusting myself that at some point there'll be a convergence of luck, skill, you know, the moment, money, people's interests, and so forth. And that's kind of what it's not a pathway that I tell my students they should go down. This is not a blueprint. It works for me, and we're all, you know, kind of individuals at that level. And in that sense, it's mostly just listen to your instincts. We don't have a support system like the competition system to equalize it. We don't have the economics and, you know, the privilege of doing architecture, of course, is we know what it is. And it's also, in America, it is a question of power and relationships and so forth. So in some ways, I had to do the kind of work I did to be able to have people who felt connected to that kind of labor and set of ideas could look at me, because I was in my, let's say, late 30s when that happened. If I'm 26 or 7, I go, not trusting you, you know, to deal with, you know, money and budgets and time and so forth. So many architects my age, you know, let's say like MVRDV or people like that, I mean, they build so much because of the competition system and so forth. But those of us in LA and those of us in America, even if we don't have that kind of system, especially if you teach, I mean, we have the best academic culture in the world by far, I would say. Even places like London are pretty high, you know, or equal, you know, or Vienna, places like that. But on the whole, the discourse in America, because we're not all just running around, you know, building all the time, it's very strong. I think it is harder to be let's say a sole practitioner for sure, and somebody who you might say comes at it from the auteur side of architecture. That model is, you know, it's going down, I think, for a number of reasons. The rise of the internet and the rise of competition. Everybody can do everything now. Everybody can express themselves. Everybody can advertise. Everybody can command media, and it makes it, you know, more crowded. Then you can't tell between what's public relations and, you know, what's work. I say that more realistically than cynically. I started before the age of the internet, and, you know, did work in a different way. That's one thing. I think the identity of the architect relative to, especially post-2008 and even more in the realm of contemporary culture and all its questions around justice and equality, has asked architects and architecture to kind of do different things and behave differently, for which, if you're, you know, practicing in this mode, culture might say that's too selfish or too singular in a way. So it's difficult, but it's also, I think it's always challenging. I wouldn't say anything's easier. I would say the conditions have changed, and the way in which people have to go about establishing practices is different. It's not completely based on the same factors, I think, that it was when we started. But you're right. Let's say if you go back to when Ray Cappy, was young in the 1950s, there was so much work. The whole city needed to be built, number one. Number two, everybody who studied architecture at that time just kind of studied modernism. So architects were almost like soldiers and workers who could go out and help build the city, and it was almost like a fairer world. Then post-war academia, starts. Then there's different schools of thought. Then the rise of the corporate office, right? And we've seen bigger offices, what we would typically see as corporate offices, find new ways to morph into a more multifaceted type of office to do boutique work or whatever. It's still not the same, but it's a landscape that's different. I do think that my type of office will start to, maybe not completely disappear, but definitely change. It would be very hard for a very small office to get a soccer stadium anywhere, but especially in the United States, because as everything, as we know, comes from forms of expertise. If you're going to put 300 million on the line, then you're not going to go, hey, I hope it works out, or I want the weirdest stadium I've ever seen. But in Europe, you could win a competition for the soccer stadium in your hometown in Slovenia, like my friends did in Ljubljana. Soccer and the basketball arena, they won the competition. Huge project. They're like a 10-person office, and that could never happen here. It's a shame, on the one hand, that America didn't turn into that, but America's the capitalist. We're the behemoth. We're the capitalist behemoth, and the nature of dominance and the nature of scale is always going to operate here. We know it from Google and Facebook and questions about, what's too big. And everybody's left in this kind of Darwinian world, to kind of fight for, what they can do. Hitoshi, who you interviewed, he wins the competition and goes to Japan and, does the stadium. I mean, it wasn't like that allowed him to do whatever he wanted. He still had to, push in many, many ways. And when Taiwan had all those competitions, we won a competition 9 years ago for a cruise ship terminal in Taiwan that didn't get built, but it was, a $700 million building, and we had a local architect, and we were doing the work and the construction documents and everything. We won it through competition. If we would have been able to build that project, maybe that allows for other kinds of things, to happen. A small airport in Kazakhstan or something like that. So a lot of small practices are conditioned toward building smaller projects. The legacy for my work is that I do work for developers, and I am doing bigger projects for developers, and it has their own constraints. But I am dealing with a bigger piece of the urban fabric on the one hand. For anybody who's a liberal-minded person, if you're a person who has empathy, if you're a person who wants to understand and try to participate and make the world more accessible to everybody, more equitable, and yet at the same time, that the work that you do generally comes from wealth and generally comes from power. For most of the time, to be absolutely blunt, those two things don't meet up. And then we, as architects, have to either find other ways to address the shortfall or the lack of connection, other ways, whether concretely it's doing pro bono work or volunteering on the one hand, or trying to be able to give services in a way that don't connect to business or profit. And to be able to do that, you have to be able to afford to do that. And the only way in which you can afford to do that is by, engaging in the world of profit. In other words, to give back time and resources. If you teach, of course, that's an emphatic and very important forum to try to construct scenarios that address these sorts of things, yet they can't all be focused. And the whole issue of what architects can do, because we theoretically, when we build, as Rem said, you don't choose your clients. You can choose not to take a client, but you don't walk around and go, great, you'll do a building and I'll design it. So we are in some ways, we're powerless in some ways, and on the one hand powerful in other ways. More powerless at the level of politics, more powerless at the level of modulating how wealth gets distributed, because we're not in that part of the system. I think obviously we'd all like to have clients who have the most passion for trying to create the most amount of benefit for other people. I work for developers, and I always try to have the conversation as much as possible about what is our mission here. I know your mission is, a business mission, but what can I do as an architect to try to make these things, connect in a way? And in some ways, it's a musical term. It's noisy. It's dissonant. It doesn't always, connect in the way in which we want. But at the same time, I don't think those of us who practice, we're not paralyzed by it. We have to keep going. I think it's just working as much as we can to try to find those things that, that work and do the most in that way. And, we just have to live with what level of effectiveness we have. Especially when I'm teaching, my days are I would say very mixed. But if I actually tell you more specifically what I do, I get up pretty early. I go down to my studio and I work on music for an hour and a half, whether I'm researching something, reading, or trying out new sounds. I spend time, then I come to the office, and at the office I will work on both things I'm doing in UCLA, developing coursework, doing research for my courses because it's connecting to the work. And then, I'm working on the projects. My office is very small now, and I have a very small team. And then at night, there'll be generally, because my wife is also a creative person, we watch film and study in a way. We have a passion and enthusiasm for that. Or I may go back to my studio and go down and work on music. And then on the weekend, I do a lot of work on music. So it's not half my time, but as much time as possible, I'm working on music. And people will go, well, what for? And who's going to listen to it and so forth. And that's not something I kind of worry about, but I would say it's even more serious for me than a hobby. And I can see in the future less architecture and more time spent on music because I'm so passionate about it. It's within my control. And as time goes on, I want to return more and more to things that are give me the ability to reach the highest levels of what I do. And sometimes that's not always the case with architecture, as you know. There are very specific sets of questions about music, and that has to do with something like free forms of music versus structured forms of music. And what I mean by structured forms of music would be, I'm not a trained musician, so that means studying chord structures, studying scales, whether they're Western or Eastern, versus going to my synthesizer and not caring about what scale I'm in, not caring about tones and semitones, and just dealing with the nature of experience. Obviously, we know those are two worlds, whether it's in jazz on the one hand or classical music. The in-between music, let's say like Stockhausen or people who are doing experimental music and still writing it down, and free music where you want to get as far away from possible, like, you know, not song-based structures, or essentially music outside of the DAW and music in the DAW, in the software, you know, structures and bars and beats and so forth. So when I think about that relative to architecture, I think about aspects of composition and structure and levels of order and grammar and language. So music is like super cerebral and also in the gut at the same time. And I think that's a lot of what my particular kind of relationship to art and culture is. I've always liked, you know, the nerdy side of things. And I've also always liked the anarchic side of things. And that's just continuously what I study and what I work on. So, you know, I'll study and listen to, you know, craft work, and then, you know, free jazz and Ornette Coleman and all sorts of other things on the other side of it. So, yeah. Yeah, I relate to film more on formal things about the camera, framing, structuring a shot, structuring an image, and less on plot. So I'm also not super, in terms of music, of course we all like pop music, but I'm more a sound person than a narrative, lyric person in terms of my experience. And so with movies, it's of course we take the plot with it, and yet if a movie is beautiful and it doesn't have an interesting plot, I'll probably still love the movie. Most people would go, that was a terrible movie because the plot was terrible. And for me, you know, there are movies for which the narrative doesn't make sense, or is fractured, or, you know, is not put together very well. But if it's formally, you know, kind of curious and powerful, then I'll connect with that movie. So it's not like a scene represents a space and then connect a space to another space, and a scene, you know, that I've never thought about my architecture in that particular way. Mostly it's just like an analogous world of understanding how somebody goes about their, you know, craft of putting something together. I would, you know, I don't think that I would have the skill, you know, to pick up a camera and make a movie. If somebody, you know, just demanded one, I would give it a try. Just like designing furniture is not easy. I've designed it, and it's been always a challenge. I've never painted too intimidating. I would never, ever try and paint, yet I do graphic design and do photography. So there's some media that I wouldn't even try to attempt to make anything good, yet I can be a fan of it. But with music and graphic design, I feel connected to the making aspects of it and being able to filter what I do as an architect through that somehow. So film is important, but it plays a specific kind of role. Mostly, you could say it's research and inspiration. We all make our curated worlds, you know, for better or worse. And I feel like, I've been thinking about all these things for a long time. Obviously, I'm old and, you know, been in the field for 30-something years. Actually, almost 40 years. That how you connect the dots, you know, you don't know how to do that so easily when you're younger, but obviously you know how to connect those dots and how everything becomes, becomes meaningful. I want to say consciously, on the one hand, what I learned that from, or where I learned it, was Warhol, who, you know, we know his whole story. Was he an artist or not? Was he a joke or not? Was he serious or not? Obviously, it's not like I think people have looked at me and go, well, is he serious or not serious? It's mostly the idea that all he said was, I'm going to wake up every day and look around, and the possibility of anything around me working on me for ideas was something that I really feel like is the same for me today. So whether it's the landscape and what I see out in the world, whether it's a media, I feel like I can learn something from anything at this point and be able to get it into my curated world. And so that's why I'm constantly thinking about, you know, these media. At the same time, I have my tastes, and my tastes are set enough where, you know, then it's about refinement of those things. I'm not waking up every day and going, I'm going to listen to K-pop. I don't listen to K-pop. That it's great stuff, I'm sure, but I don't, no, you know what I mean? You're not going to go make a record that's completely different. It has to be something that you believe in. Anyway, so I did start teaching at Columbia, but it was before the paperless studios. It was in the 80s, before I moved out here. And it was really, the reason why I was asked to go teach at Columbia was because I had shown my work in Storefront and some other galleries, and it was, you know, this technology-based work. And Kenneth Frampton invited me to teach, and the reason why he invited me to teach is because I wasn't doing postmodernism. You're one of the few people who's not doing postmodernism, you should come and teach. So in a way, there was an ideological thing. You know, Kenneth dropped me in to teach another you know, way. I didn't know how to do that. Then when I came to SciArc, you know, I taught, and then when I came back to do a visiting studio at Columbia, that was the first year of the paperless studio. Greg was there, Jesse Reiser, Stan Allen, etc. 2 years later, I became the director at SciArc, and it was my goal to get SciArc from the analog, from, you know, such a strong analog world, right? Making mock-ups, full-scale stuff, weight, matter, pouring concrete. And I was actually not coming from that place at all. I was always coming from the place of like drawing, and I moved right into digital work. And I said, well, if I'm going to be the director, I'm going to get to school, you know, quickly into the realm of the digital. And there were fights along the way. And then Greg went to UCLA and essentially did that at UCLA. Because Greg was Greg was one of the most sophisticated, people in the United States, as you know, working with software and proto-fabrication ideas. And so he got UCLA on the ramp up. And then I joined a few years later and kind of continued that. But the digital, especially with the CCA and Greg, now that's just like an origin myth in architecture. Now it's just, okay, the digital world is the digital world, and even if you like matter, you're still dealing with the digital world, and that conversation has shifted to post-digital and to questions of, I think, a lot about, you're 29, you said? You're a Gen Z. You're not millennial. You're too young for millennial. I don't know. But how students think today, independent of how they're taught, because students are more conditioned toward thinking both either independently or as a group by digital media, i.e. Instagram and things like that. School and the position of the teacher and the professor have a much, much different role today than before. Just to kind of get back to teaching in a way, it's not only different for an architect, but I would say it's even more radically different for a teacher, given the way in which students learn on their own, learn as a group, and learn in school, and how all of those things go together. Whereas mostly students were less influenced by media and more by what the culture of the school was, and therefore the voice of the professor and so forth, or the community of that school. And I think it's a little bit less that way now, and more horizontal, a little more generic. To be quite honest, as long as there's openness, as long as there's an interest in the contemporary, as long as there's an interest in the operativity of things, even though you want to think independently, then I think, everybody should be free to teach as long as they want, for sure. I don't know what my future is, I don't expect to stop, and say, here's the limit of what I think, and now it's just going to be a kind of imperious, heavy approach. No. Obviously, the teachers that you think are viable and interesting are the ones that can combine a certain amount of so-called wisdom, or experience that defines who you are. At the same time, what does it mean to think in a new way? Do you know Jeff Kipnis?
Yes.
The name?
I have an interview with him.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll maybe get to Ohio one day and interview Jeff. But and he's an important figure for a lot of people in the United States who teach, who practice, and for whom the idea, of the new or progress, just in these general cultural terms, is always, a topic. At the same time, I can remember have a conversation with him about keeping up. Like, well, at a certain point, you don't worry about keeping up because you have your ways of thinking. And then the question is, are your ways of thinking dead? As opposed to having ways of thinking that are somehow miraculously vital, constantly vital. And that's what I think, hope is useful, and which is what I think about teaching, is that I can move my teaching project along, understand my audience. My students are different than they were 10 years ago. Communicate with them in contemporary ways, as opposed to, you'll be in my studio and we'll talk as though it was in 1985. Obviously, that's not what anyone wants to do. Yet at the same time, I think serious people have their commitment to certain ideas that they want to keep moving along. So the hardest thing is the most general thing, which was, what does it mean to design? And the anecdote about that was two moments. I think I was in my 4th year, and I had a professor. I was always interested in complexity. Couldn't tell you why. Because I think I associated it with the new. And, fewer lines wasn't the new, more lines was the new. And the professor said, you have no idea how difficult it is, to make a simple project. And I said, I don't know why I would make something simple. I don't even know why I would do that or why the world would want that. Pretty naive thought. I made my hyper complex work all the way through graduate school, and I went to Europe after school, and I lived in Paris, and I visited Corbusier's work and Auguste Perret's work and Le Proust, and I was able to see architecture, in a different way. And I went back and I moved to New York, and like for a year, all I did was draw, like Le Corbusier, spheres, cubes, and cones. And I drew them, I drafted them, and I would shade them and really meditate. And I said, I've got to figure out how not to make something simple, but to get out of the idea that somehow complexity was the only mode of operation. And if somebody heard me say that now or watches the interview, they go, well, you didn't learn anything about what it means to make anything simple, because I look at your work and it seems pretty complicated. And I would say to that person, you know what, it's really simple underneath it all. And that's what I figure out how to do, to find an economy and a way of working with geometry, with massing, with program organization. The hardest thing was to figure out ways in which I could find simplicity within that and not give up what I thought was a project, on the visual level. So I studied also minimalist painting. I studied minimalist sculpture as almost like an antidote. And when I mixed all that together, as the years went by, the hardest thing I had to learn was, what did it mean to design in a way that felt natural rather than intellectually artificial. And that took, 20 years really to figure out how to do that. And that allowed me to get to the point where when I started building, I felt pretty comfortable that I was going to be able to find a way to build what I thought was going to have pretty intense effects. And that's been my interest in architecture. So that was the hardest thing. What was the other part of the question? Looking to the future. Well, looking to the future, it's the last question. I mean, I think of film, 2001. I think of what does it mean to think about the future. The future isn't about aliens on Mars, obviously. The future is about, the sustainability of the planet, right? We live in a world now where environmental challenges are everywhere. Social challenges, and what architecture's role is. I think every architect who has a liberal mind and who's empathetic is thinking about that. The question is, what are the answers for that, and how does one practice? Going back a little bit to the earlier part of the interview, and maybe for me, other media will start to, inform me or say I can communicate better if I made a book and wrote more about questions or ideas, because I can theorize in that format. Maybe it means, and I do want to do more books, coming up. that are in some ways theoretical. I do want to do a book on sound, music, and architecture from my own perspective. That would be a book I'm sure you would love to have. Maybe not a lot of people, but I know you would. Yeah, so it's you know, like what's the future of the world in terms of life? Not what's the next form in architecture or what's the next new material or that kind of sense of the future. How are we going to 3D print a building or anything? I'm not really on that kind of thought process right now, because it all has to be related to, you know, these larger cultural and environmental questions, which are so staggering now that no one can avoid being confronted, you know, with those kinds of things. South America, I'm sure the same thing. I mean, plus all of the issues of the social and the economical, you know, in place. I would love to come see you in Lima, and I'm going to put that on my list to get down there sometime, and I want the full tour.